England has collapsed politically and economically.
The most volatile day of trading for sterling in modern record.
The Leave campaign don't have a post-Brexit plan.
It will not be plain sailing in the days ahead.
Facing the fury of EU leaders in Brussels.
Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. Here are some of the media stories we're covering this week. Britain and the fallout from the referendum. Are the papers that backed Brexit changing their tune? In South Africa, the state-owned broadcaster has just hired its 10th CEO in the last 7 years. Solitary confinement, USA. It's a huge story, and some of the prisoners are now doing the reporting. And is it a giant purple dinosaur? A flying death robot? No, it's just Donald Trump, Japanese style. It's been a little more than a week now since the UK voted itself out of the European Union, and amidst the resulting chaos in the political and economic spheres, the resignation of Prime Minister David Cameron, the steep drop in the value of the British pound, we've also seen developments on the media side of this story. Rupert Murdoch's tabloid, The Sun, which backed Brexit, claims that it swung the vote and may well have a point. There's also been a post-referendum tonal shift. Newspapers that during the campaign backed the Leave side, arguing that Britain needed to reclaim its sovereignty and billions in transfer payments from Brussels, are now warning of tough times ahead, a narrative more in line with what papers on the Remain side were saying before the vote. An overarching critique that papers on both sides are hearing is about detail. There was far too little of it during the campaign coverage, and it came much too late. British broadcasters work under regulations written to ensure that both sides get their say. But were those channels really as impartial as they claim to be? Our starting point this week is London.
The UK electorate has taken the historic decision to withdraw from the European Union.
To the victors go the headlines, although Britain's right-wing press did rather spoil the party. After months of championing Brexit, using their front pages like blunt instruments, hammering their readers with anti-EU headlines, their moment of triumph was tempered by a clear change in editorial tone.
Amongst the newspapers that supported Leave, there was a certain amount of gloating. But there was also, interestingly, a certain amount of caution. The Daily Mail, for example, that was very clearly in favour of Leave, was also writing about some of the economic problems that lay ahead, something it had pretty much failed to do during the campaigns.
It was almost as if the newspapers were thinking, what have we done here? And you had, for example, the Express starting to talk about what this is going to mean for the pound, the value of the pound, which prior to that had never entered into any of its coverage at all.
The immediate media reaction was quite triumphalist in some sectors of the media, particularly in the tabloid media, and rather horror-stricken in most of the non-tabloid media. The Telegraph, amazingly, announced Boris Johnson's programme for what should happen next as a newspaper column, which is a very interesting example of use of the media, but rather than discussion in Parliament or in some serious public forum, a newspaper column set out what has been the most coherent statement so far of the Brexiters' policy proposals going forward.
Boris Johnson and his cohort in the Leave campaign, Michael Gove, are both former journalists. Typical journalists, in that they have proven to be better at messaging than planning. A point that was brought home by Sky News' political editor the weekend after the vote.
I said to him, so where's the plan? Can we see the Brexit plan now? There is no plan. The Leave campaign don't have a post-Brexit plan.
But for journalists to call out politicians for a lack of foresight is a little rich, given the limited focus of the coverage leading up to the vote. Reporting that dwelled on personalities delivering the speeches and hot-button topics like immigration, but failed to dig deeper and properly address the larger question, what if?
We know from the research that's been done now on the news coverage of the campaign that immigration, the economy and the conduct of the campaign itself dominated all the coverage. So actually those technical questions, vital issues for the future of the UK, and our relationships with the rest of the world really weren't debated at all.
People who complain that the media didn't give enough coverage to what the options would be if Britain voted to leave, I think probably weren't paying very close attention. I certainly had seen various different Brexit scenarios explored.
It cannot be denied that there was very little discussion on the substance of what the process would be. And we are seeing, I think, the limitations not just of Britain's government and not just of Britain's political class, but we're seeing the limitations of the media in dealing with events which they did not expect.
What Britons are not seeing are limitations in the power of the press. 5 years ago, it looked like they might. After the phone hacking scandal at Rupert Murdoch's tabloids, a lengthy judicial inquiry into politics and the press recommended the UK papers be regulated. The Cameron government, backed by Murdoch and other press barons, rejected the idea. And Cameron was backed by those papers when narrowly re-elected last year. But not this time, and Murdoch's tabloid The Sun proudly claims to have swung the referendum vote. Its editor, Tony Gallagher, was quoted in The Guardian saying, "So much for the waning power of the print media."
I would take Tony Gallagher's comments with a pinch of salt. In an electoral contest in which the margin of victory is so narrow, any number of people who campaigned for the winning side can claim that they made the critical difference. They put their side over the top. So I don't buy this narrative that's emerging that the reason the British electorate voted for Brexit is because they were misled by a team of dishonest, conniving politicians in cahoots with the media.
I think it's still the case today that The Sun does have an important influence on the votes of its readers, because many of the readers of The Sun, more than other newspapers, aren't actually particularly active online, aren't active especially on new media in any political sense, and don't get an awful lot of news sources to compare it with. So The Sun probably not only has many readers, it probably does have more influence over its readers than many other newspapers.
And influence over viewers as well, because the UK papers often set the news agenda for broadcast journalism. 70% of the newspapers sold in Britain are conservative. Many of them echoed one of the Leave campaign's primary messages, fear of immigrants. The Remain side relied on scare stories as well, of what would happen to the UK economy. But, as The Guardian reported, quoting a senior Remain official, economic fear messages are fine if they're going to be echoed every day in the right-wing press, creating an echo chamber that the broadcasters have to follow. But the press was never on our side.
BBC in particular, it was more impartial than the press coverage, but it tends to follow an agenda that is set by the press.
Look at the papers that have 5 times the circulation of the Financial Times.
And all news media follows that press agenda, and one of the reasons for that is that actually they have an awful lot of space to fill now, and fewer journalists, and the kind of news agendas that are out there just get recirculated.
BBC, who are terrified of certain right-leaning newspapers like the Daily Mail and the Sun and the newspapers owners, because they imagine they can do the BBC harm, they were terrified of accusations from that side that they weren't impartial. And what that meant was that they couldn't make editorial judgments. So if a very well-respected economic research group came up with a claim that clearly favoured Remain,
standing alone, UK loses the bargaining capacity.
They would balance that with somebody from the Leave side saying, oh, that's a lot of nonsense.
If we leave the EU, we will be able to negotiate those free trade agreements on our own.
With no evidence to back it up. And therefore the viewer thinks, well, that's kind of equal.
Brexit is a political story with multiple media subplots. 2 former journalists who led the Leave campaign with sound bites ready and no real plan. a prime minister who refused to regulate the press, brought down by a referendum in which the press boasts it played a decisive role. A story that will run and run, one that will continue to be told by and entrusted to some of the same newspapers that claim to have made it happen. On the download now, our viewers on the continuing coverage of Britain's referendum on the EU.
The broadcast media did a much better job than the news, despite the difficulties they faced in creating a kind of equal debate in appearance between Leave and Remain. And if you look at the press now, they're kind of rowing back from their extreme rhetoric, especially in the right-wing press, because we've had this surge of hate crimes and racist attacks in Britain, and suddenly the press has kind of dialed down their language.
Much of the content in the lead-up to the debate was incredibly inflammatory. It was mostly politicians criticising one another, making outlandish statements. Now we're seeing a lot of the people who did vote are actually saying that had I known some of the information that I know now, rather than seeing inflammatory content on what everyone's saying before, they may have actually voted differently.
Other media stories that are on our radar this week. To put a new twist on an old line, to lose one chief executive officer at the state-owned South African Broadcasting Corporation is unfortunate. To lose two is just careless. And the SABC has just lost its 9th CEO since President Jacob Zuma took power 7 years ago. Jimmy Matthews resigned on June 27th over what he called a corrosive atmosphere at the SABC and a feud with Chief Operating Officer Hlaudi Motsoneng.
You adhere to the policy of the SABC.
A month ago, Motsoneng announced that the SABC would no longer broadcast violent political protests, would not refer to newspaper reporting in its coverage, and urged other networks to do the same. Matthews' resignation follows the suspension of 3 other SABC staffers, economics editor Thandeka Kubule, Fota Kriege, an executive editor on the radio side, and journalist Sunavan Ter. The 3 were suspended over editorial differences and for fighting a management directive not to cover a protest against censorship at the public broadcaster. One day after Jimmy Matthews' resignation, SABC's chief financial officer, James Aguma, considered to be a close ally of Motsoneng, was announced as the new CEO. The change has come 2 months ahead of local elections in South Africa that will serve as a barometer on the popularity of the ANC. A Johannesburg-based media freedom group called SOS said that the SABC is at the precipice of not only practicing censorship, but losing all credibility and posing a clear and present danger to our democracy. One of the few remaining voices on the Egyptian airwaves critical of the El-Sisi government has been silenced, taken off the air, arrested, and deported. Liliane Daoud, who hosted a talk show on a private network on TV, was arrested at her home in Cairo and eventually expelled. She is of Lebanese descent and was taken to Beirut. Daoud's contract was terminated after 5 years, and another program host at On TV, Gabor Al-Karmouti, has also lost his job. On TV's editorial line has shifted over the past month after Ahmed Abu Hashima, a pro-government businessman, acquired the network from media mogul Naguib Sawiris. Daoud has said on Twitter that she will fight a legal and diplomatic battle to return to Cairo. But an Egyptian official reportedly told the Associated Press that Daoud will not be allowed back into Egypt. In Algeria, the Bouteflika government is either showing that it lacks a sense of humor or that there are official limits on how far political satire can go. 2 satirical shows on KBC TV, a privately owned channel, were taken off the air on June 24th, and 2 employees were arrested. Managing director Mehdi Banaissa and producer Riyad Hartouf stand accused of falsifying permits and complicity in abusive position. They could face more than 10 years in prison if found guilty. According to the Algerian authorities, KBC TV obtained a government license to broadcast 2 programs on the basis that they would focus on arts and culture. But both shows also tackled social and political issues and aired allegations of corruption against President Abdelaziz Bouteflika and other government officials. KBC TV is owned by the El Kabar Media Group, which owns a newspaper also called El Kabar, known for its opposition to the Bouteflika government. Now to the United States and the coverage of a human rights issue that most Americans have never heard of. The numbers are difficult to nail down, but somewhere between 80 and 100,000 prisoners in American jails are currently being held in solitary confinement. 100,000. That's the equivalent of a small city, like having the population of Green Bay, Wisconsin, or South Bend, Indiana, locked up in a small cell, isolated for all but 90 minutes a day. The lack of coverage of this issue in the U.S. news media comes down mostly to access. The prisons rarely let reporters in to do those stories. Some people are trying to change that, including independent journalists working on the margins of the media establishment, and they're beginning to have an impact. The Listening Post's Marcela Pizarro now on some of them, including one journalist who's bypassed prison authorities by using the post office and turning prisoners into reporters.
For James Ridgway, reporting the story of solitary confinement in the US has been something of a solitary pursuit. Over the past 7 years, every week, Ridgway has been going to his local post office, collecting letters sent to him from prisons around the country. The letters serve as key source material because they come from key sources, people held in isolation, in 6 by 9 foot cells for 22.5 hours per day, for days, weeks, months, even years.
Well, when we started our project, there was literally hardly anything about solitary confinement in the press, in the TV or newscasts or papers. The only way I could connect with people was through letters, through just plain letters. No phones, no emails, no real visits, no press contacts. I sort of thought to myself, these guys are reporters. What they've got to say is the way in. That's the way in. That's the way to break the security.
I did experience over 13 years in incarceration, 5 of which was in solitary. And you got over 80,000 people in solitary confinement in the United States, close to 4,000 in New York State. Hopefully you'll learn something, get inspired. When we mentioned these numbers to folks, they said, no, this can't be happening in America. But yes, it is happening in America. It's happening every day.
Nobody thought about solitary confinement as something that occurs in the United States. You might have thought of it as something that occurs in totalitarian regimes around the world. But solitary confinement in the United States, as a routine and integral and normalized part of our criminal justice system, has really been invisible until very recently.
We were trying to do a report. We wanted to do a report.
No, you can't go on the island. You're gonna have to make a right, go into this parking lot and just shoot back out that way. That'll take you out.
Can we do anything can we film anything in the parking lot?
No, you can't videotape here.
On any given day, there are more than 80,000 people held in isolation in the US prison system. Some would say that that constitutes a big story. The problem is that journalists are not allowed into prisons like Rikers Island here in New York City. They have no access. And with no access, it's the story itself that risks being held in isolation.
Underreporting is one problem. Misrepresentation is another. Across TV and film, prisoners held in solitary, portrayed as 21st century boogeymen.
And what's that, Mickey? I'm a natural-born killer.
Psychopaths.
I'll help you catch him, Clary.
Killers.
If you're stabbed or killed in these other places or done something real serious, that's where everybody goes to.
That's had an impact. A complex story of a huge problem in the US criminal justice system has been oversimplified in popular culture and in public perception.
You know, I've met people who really believe that the system is balanced, that everyone in solitary deserves to be there because they're violent, you know, but yet have never been to prison. So the only other explanation is where they're receiving these messages from.
Unfortunately, there is still a tendency that prisoners in solitary confinement are portrayed as extremely dangerous people for whom there really is no other alternative, and that's just not the case. Solitary confinement units in the United States are stuffed to the rafters with the mentally ill, with the developmentally disabled. People are put in solitary confinement for having too many postage stamps, for having too many pencils.
They are the walking dead. That's how they're viewed. And What can I say? I mean, you know, I don't view him as a white. I view him as a fantastic army of reporters. So we've built a list now of 4,000 people. Now, a lot of them don't say much of anything, but every once in a while, you'll get a letter that has real information in it that's really valuable in terms of understanding how the system works.
Ridgway has been documenting that system on Solitary Watch, a news site he set up in 2009. The site has reported on hunger strikes amongst prisoners, tracked cases of prisoners working for prison reform being punished with solitary confinement, and it's focused on every angle, every detail of conditions in isolation. In March 2013, Solitary Watch published an essay by William Blake, a New York State inmate held in solitary for nearly 26 years for the murder of a police officer. It got more than 500,000 clicks. And the letters from Adam Hall, who went to prison for attempted arson and ended up in solitary. His correspondence has been used to spotlight a key issue, the criminalization of mental illness.
Solitary Watch get first-hand stories of what these people are being subjected to. They have a tendency of humanizing the folk and giving them a sense of hope to voice their suffering to the public. It should make societies try to investigate whether or not this is actually occurring.
Most reporters and most newspapers, media, will concentrate on the big bad criminal. So we try to bury him in a polite manner. In a 6x9 cell, he's interesting, but we don't want him to get out. He's sort of a devil, and he is evil. He's always evil.
And of course, we have places like the Marshall Project, Solitary Watch, and even Vice, who have balanced that out by, injecting and infusing, first-hand accounts and narratives into the conversation.
Ridgway is no longer alone in his campaign to get stories on solitary from the inside. In May this year, the New York Times published an interactive series chronicling the experiences of people on death row. The cartoonist who illustrated the series drew his inspiration from sketches by prisoners. In April, The Guardian produced its first virtual reality film, giving viewers a sense of what it means to be held in such a confined space. 7 former inmates contributed to that report. And 6 months ago, President Obama penned an op-ed in the Washington Post announcing a plan to decrease the use of solitary confinement in federal prisons. Media attention on what's being called one of the US's largest domestic human rights issues is finally on the agenda. And finally, audiences are beginning to hear some of the solitary voices that remain in confinement.
Finally, they say that satire at its most effective requires an element of truth, but sometimes the satirist can be too subtle. The satirical message can get lost. That would appear to be the case with something called the Japanese Donald Trump ad that's making the rounds on social media. The ad uses techniques made famous by Japanese animators and features a young woman captivated by the idea of Trump becoming president of the world. The ad does end with a robot Trump destroying the earth, but millions of views later, the video's creator was hearing complaints that his video was too subtle and could be mistaken for a real Trump ad, to which he replied, "I don't know. I guess it depends on whether you think Trump literally blowing up the planet is bad." We'll see you next time here at The Listening Post.